Okay, so it's a very, very nice sunny day, I think. And
there's no better conditions to do some music theory, of course.
exactly. And that's what we are doing right now with
Perfect.
sort of a premiere for me. I want to analyze a song by the Danish guitarist and composer Rolf Hansen. And I'm going to show you a picture first, and you can guess which city it is from.
Okay.
But I have to sort of do it in that manner that you can't see.
Ah, the name. Okay, I will look away just in case.
Yeah, please look away.
I'm looking away. I'm not here.
Okay.
Okay.
So, very hard question.
Well, this looks like Berlin.
True. Do you know the street?
Do I know the street? Wait, I might actually.
I wouldn't recognize it, I have to say.
Is it Google Maps?
I found it on Wikipedia, so probably,
okay.
yeah, it's probably Google Maps also.
Okay, no, I don't know this street. I mean, maybe I do, but I don't recognize it.
Okay, it's the Gotenstraße.
Okay, yeah.
And this is also the title of the song.
Oh, okay.
Called Gotenstraße.
I see.
And that's, yeah, we can think about what it means. I mean, I know first-hand knowledge, he lived there in Gotenstraße.
All right, okay.
Some time ago. So it is quite a song maybe about how he felt living there, we could say.
Okay.
And now I want to play you 4 chords, the first 4 chords of the song. And my question would be now a musical one. Which of these 4 chords could be the tonal center?
Okay.
That's already it. The first 4 chords.
Okay.
I can also play it again if you like. It's a bit.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, the first 2 chords, which repeat, I would say, share, let's say, the position of being tonic or tonic substitute. Just because of the order they appear in, I would tend to say the first one is the tonic, but it would also be completely possible that the second one is actually the tonic, right? But in any case, they kind of work as substitute of each other, I would say.
Yeah, and it's actually just not very clear, right? So to break it down for the audience, we have a D major 7 chord going to C sharp minor. Mm-hmm. That's the first 2 chords you identify as possibly tonic, which I would sort of agree. And then we have a direct transposition, but now just G major without the major 7 into F sharp minor.
Yeah.
And now it is hard to exactly say essentially which of these 4 chords are the tonic. I'm gonna show you the first part of my analysis. It's just about what we heard.
Yeah.
So here are the chords: D major 7, C sharp minor, repeated, and then G major to F sharp minor. And now I constructed 4 scales for these 4 chords.
Okay.
Right, and that might also help us, might support your thesis that it might be the first chord, because when we have the scale on D, we have sort of an, how do you call it, octatonic scale, I guess, so 8 notes. And we have a major scale plus a Lydian fourth, so this raised fourth.
Okay.
And if we would take the second possibility, C sharp minor, we would get a Locrian scale, but also a perfect fifth, which would be Phrygian.
Yes.
We wouldn't have the diminished fifth. Yeah, sort of a Locrian scale. And the possibilities we didn't really discuss would be G Lydian scale plus, you could say, Phrygian second. So if you would write A flat, a minor second, or from F sharp minor, we would have a Phrygian scale plus a major second, which is sometimes, I think, in jazz theory, it is a Phrygian scale plus natural 9 or something like that. So it's an actual scale.
Okay.
But of course, one of these 4 scales is the most common one, right? We might expect.
It's the first one, I would say.
And that would be the major scale, in fact. But still, it is quite unclear. It could well be C sharp minor, because this is also a Phrygian connection, right?
Yeah.
So it is not very normal Phrygian, because we would have C sharp major, and we will talk about that extensively, because I think it's very, very interesting in this weird Phrygian connection with a minor chord in the end. But let's hear the whole loop, and then it's going to be very, very clear that we are in fact in D major.
Okay.
And now it's not a big mystery at all.
Indeed. Yes, we would definitely have a cadence.
Yeah, here 4-5-1. And now the form we hear is quite clearly a period. Period always having A, B, A, C, or A, B, prime, something like that. And we have that the antecedent phrase has A and B. B being merely almost a mere transposition of A.
Yeah.
And then in the consequent phrase, we have again A slightly altered, but only in the melody. And then we have B prime, which is also slightly altered, but now quite more regularly being a transposition, not having the 4-5-1 connection to the next phrase, because we get an additional bridge of two beats long, so 2/4 bar, and that's the formal setting of the loop.
Okay.
And now what is interesting here, I think, is the slight irregularities of that form. So we have this 3/4 bar in the first B.
Yeah.
And this leads to the entrance of the consequent phrase of A slightly sooner than we would expect.
Yeah, indeed.
And it also, I think, it gives a little subtle energy boost to the consequent phrase, right? It's sort of it's a metrical acceleration. And that's a nice effect to have a sort of a boost for the consequent phrase. And the same thing sort of happens here, but we have a bit more time because now we don't have a 3/4 bar. The B phrase is really as long as it should be. And then we get an additional very tiny bridge moment where we essentially have the same thing going on the second B bar. So we could actually connect these two bars, bar 4 and bar 9, having a very similar function. And this is quite a lot to personalize this model, right? It's not the standard period model, but it has some personal, very sort of unique slight alterations, which also makes sense musically.
Yeah.
So this I like very much because you can understand the period. It's a very simple form, but then you also can appreciate a bit more complex, a bit more detailed personalizations, so to speak.
Yeah.
I like the idea that we have in that B phrase, we have sort of a bridge moment within the B phrase, and then we split the functions into two entities in the end of the consequent phrase. Maybe let's just listen to that again, and let's pay attention to these slight metrical alterations. I'm just going to play the repetition of the form. Okay. So the second time the period is played. And there's a sort of an improvisational arpeggio in the next loop we would hear. But I don't want to spoil too much of the song. You should buy that. Everybody. I think that was quite clear what I mean with that metrical acceleration and the personalization of the form. Now we have also, I think, a quite personalized harmony. And we already talked about the phrygian chord, which is, we are in D major, so the phrygian chord is not really in the right place, so to speak. We would normally traditionally have the phrygian chord from B flat to A major, let's say, which also could work in a major key, just as a sort of a mixture of major and minor. But here it is quite in the diatonic area of D major, just having a slight alteration because C sharp minor needs a G sharp, and that's why we actually get this major scale plus a Lydian fourth in order to make this work. Because otherwise we would have C sharp diminished, and that wouldn't sound Phrygian at all. And it wouldn't sound like a stable connection of two chords. We see, due to these chord progressions of seconds, we avoid the falling fifths, which would be the very typical, very normal way to construct chord progressions. But in the structure itself, to mark the boundaries of the antecedent and the consequent phrase, we have actually a very clear falling fifths as a part of a 4-5-1 cadence.
Yeah.
So the outer boundaries are set by the very traditional normal falling fifths, but within the structure we have these second chord progressions which add much more color to the whole structure, right? We get two chords which are very, very uncommon in a major scale. We get the third scale degree, which is always sort of a neglected scale degree because very often we don't play actually the third scale degree being a minor chord, but we sort of make a dominant out of it, leading to the sixth scale degree, which would be much more common. But as a scale degree, as a pure scale degree, it is somewhat neglected, at least in many styles.
Yeah.
And of course, the seventh scale degree shouldn't even be there in that manner, right? It wouldn't be a minor chord. So we have two minor chords which are extremely fresh, so to speak, right? So they are pretty out of the normal system how to use traditionally the diatonic major scale, but they are opposed, as you said, sort of substitute. They're connected to the very common chords, actually, being the tonic chord D major in that instance, and the subdominant chord of the fourth scale degree G major. And again, that is a sign for really good music in my eyes, that you have simple things on the surface supporting the basic structure, but then we have very interesting details within that structure. So I like that quite a lot. Now, when we talk about substitutes, I mean, if we would be technical about it and use jazz music theory, we would talk about modal interchanges.
Yes.
So actually, D major 7 would be a modal interchange of G sharp minor or major, and G major would be a modal interchange of C sharp. I think it's not really applying here. It's not really a jazzy piece. The musician Rolf Hansen is experienced in jazz, so but I think he uses it in a really distinct manner. Because you have the chords are not very jazzy. You just have one major seventh chord, and apart from that, you have simple triads, which is something you really wouldn't find in jazz music, I would say.
Yeah.
You need some additions.
I think what made me think that the first two chords were substitutes of each other is that in this specific case, they are almost one chord.
Yeah.
Because you have the G sharp and the C sharp already in D major 7. And when you have C sharp minor, all you add is an E. And an E could very well be the ninth of the D major 7. So it almost sounds as if it was only one chord.
Yeah.
And that you just put some different notes of the chord in the spotlight. Whereas the second one between G and F sharp minor, I also perceived it as being much sharper as a difference. And it is, right? Because this time there is no mixing of the notes, right? They have nothing in common. Even though they could, right? If G had the same added notes, then it would work fine, but it doesn't. So you really hear it as a chromatic slide, whereas you don't in the first two bars, I would argue.
That's a very important point, I think. Yeah, because the major addition really melts these two chords, the major 7 being just the tonic note or the root note of the C sharp minor. And also when you see, as you said, that I noticed something I overlooked before, you see the middle ground here, the chords.
Yeah, exactly.
This is already G sharp and C sharp, so it's already belonging to what's coming next. And this is such a nice detail, because then this is missing, right? It's not being an anticipation in the middle ground. It's just G major. I mean, I'm sort of confident about my analysis. I don't have a score, so I just trust my ears. And I think this is a really, really subtle device of having a transposition, but not quite. And this not quite part is very, very important, as you pointed out. The melting in the first instance and the more harsh positing of these two chords. And this is important, of course, for the harmonic setting of the whole loop, you could say. Now, what I would add, what is missing, is the quite obvious fact that these two chords, D major and C sharp minor, are in a certain distance to G major and F sharp minor being a falling fifth.
Yes,
so
of course.
there we have another simple structure thing, right, which supports the understanding on the surface, which you always, I think, need when you want to have some intersubjectivity and when you really want to influence people on different levels, or let's say touch people on different levels. And this is another additional layer, you could say. So the falling fifths is a very important interval here, but it's a structural interval and not so much an interval of the progression itself. Of course, we have the 4-5-1 progression, and there we have also the chord progression itself. But otherwise, the transposition, that's a structural thing. That could be the sentence for the whole piece: an effective combination of simple structure and complex content. Right. Mm-hmm. Well, here you have a reduction of the harmonies to main function. Yeah. Again, to just establish that very simple outline.
Yeah.
I just killed the chords on the third beat, and then you get really a very, very simple structure.
Yes.
Now, before we go to the second part of the video, which would be analytical contextualizations, I'd like to speak about the instrumentation just a little bit. So we have 3 dimensions. We have a very low bass line. We have chords in the middle ground, and we have the melody on top. Right? So bass line, actually here also chords in that instance. We will talk about that because it's very important that the D major 7th chord going to C sharp minor. This is also from the instrumentation viewpoint very, very unique and very telling, and has many advantages to just sort of a simpler outline. But to simplify it, we have a bass line, we have chords in the middle ground, and we have a melody. And all that is quite low, right? So if we would use American pitch notation, I think we would have a D2 here going to E4 if we would get the whole impetus of the piece. Of course, in the middle section of the song, we have the arpeggio, and that's something else. But the basic form is quite in a low setting. Mm-hmm. Now you notice that we have a very low bass line here and very low chords, which are necessary to establish D major because the middle ground has already the anticipation of the C sharp minor chord. Mm-hmm. And then we have this leap of a major 7th to the C sharp being, I guess, C3. I'm not so fluent in American pitch notation, but would be a C sharp 3.
Yeah.
And this is a very important thing here, because in the other lines, we don't have that. The bass line is pretty smooth. And you have this feeling, you get this very sad phrygian cadence, but it is also not too dark, right? Because the C sharp minor chord is now in a quite light setting compared to the D major 7th. Mm-hmm. And so you don't have a too desolate and too depressing sounding phrygian connection. And you got that by the visceral interpretation of D major 7 being the tonic chord. You have more emphasis. You have more emphasis on that chord because it's so low.
Yeah.
And so this is a really, really original setting of that still quite original chord progression being C sharp minor and not C sharp major as it should be in a normal phrygian progression. Now, if we go to the sound color, we should also add the slides, the chromatic slides, mm-hmm. which is sort of a lamentation gesture. I would interpret it as that. This slide of the falling fourths is really emblematic for that piece. And maybe we should also listen again, at least to the antecedent phrase, and then we also can hear again this leap of the 7th, which is so important.
Okay.
there's another slide in the bass line, and it's the only slide in the bass line.
Mm-hmm.
From C sharp to G. You could say it's sort of quite similar to this slide, right? So the main motive being the falling fourths,
Yeah.
the melody, and now it's a falling fourth in the bass, but it's an augmented fourth, and that's a really nice structural thing, right? So it's a slight imitation of the melody, and it also marks the boundary between A and B.
Mm-hmm.
Because we don't have the slide in the bass somewhere else, and we have this fourth being really imitation of the melody.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing I forgot regarding to that phrygian chord connection, we don't have a third here. We get that third only with that upbeat note.
Yeah, that's true.
So another quite original approach here to thin out that chord, which gets a very ancient sound, because you actually can do that in Renaissance time. You can close with a 5/8 chord. It's not very uncommon.
Yeah.
And also in the Phrygian connection. And then the E natural being the upbeat here, you hear that quite to the right because it's an upbeat, but it's also completing the chord to a C sharp minor chord. And this is all what I would describe under personalization here of a traditional harmonic device, could say. Mm-hmm. Let's go to the second part, which is also very interesting. I wondered quite a bit about that connection of these two chords. I wrote them again in a very a bit more simplified version here. Mm-hmm. And if you would like to hear a normal Phrygian cadence with these chords, I could just play that for you on my very nice MIDI sound. Would be the song, and then the normal thing. For example, right?
Yeah.
You could do that easily, I think. And now I wondered what happens when we actually have a minor chord, because that shouldn't be really possible in Renaissance times, actually. You shouldn't stop on a minor chord. Because in the mean tone tuning, the minor third is quite dissonant, and the major third is best major third you can get, having the pure ratios 5/4. And so it's not a really Renaissance like chord progression, but still you get that. I noticed that in one very famous, maybe the most Phrygian piece of all times, the Mille Regrets by Josquin, right? And actually we have, in the beginning, it's, of course, this is not a closing chord, that couldn't be possible, but in the beginning of the piece, we have that very, very original, again, very original approach to the Phrygian cadence. And let's just play the beginning of the piece. Yeah, so very original, quite untypical opening of a Renaissance piece. And of course, now we have a D minor going to E minor, so it's not purely the Phrygian connection, but I would argue that it's very, very close, right? So the bass has this little ornamentation, you might say, but you still get the Phrygian connection quite clearly in my eyes.
Yeah.
And it's not unlike Gotenstraße, really iconic for the whole song. The first two bars, let's say, Mille Regrets. And now this would be the first historical account for this Phrygian connection resolving into a minor chord. The second I had to search for a long time, because you can imagine it's possibly not something classical composers might use, and even romantic composers, well, you might know more about that, but I thought immediately maybe Puccini, something like that, a tonal language that is already quite liberated from the falling fifths sort of dogma. And by Puccini is famous for juxtaposing very distant chords, stuff like that. But as it goes, sometimes you search the needle in the haystack and you just don't find anything. So I didn't find something in Puccini, which doesn't mean there's nothing there, because I don't really know very much about Puccini, sadly. But I found actually, a bit by accident, by Umberto Giordano, this Andrea Chenier, this opera, I found actually something resembling, again, very closely to this Phrygian connection, resolving into a minor key. Now, the opera is about the French Revolution and poet Andrea Chenier, who will be executed French Revolution style with a guillotine. In this moment, we should also always talk about the context, because I think it's really a topos. In the Mille Regrets, it was regret about abandon a lover. And here in this Andrea Chenier opera, it's about I think the lover of Andrea Chenier. I forgot her name, but she sings about her past and that her mother died in a fire, but she still sort of rescued her out of the fire, something like that. And so it's also about this feeling of loneliness, right? And having lost a very important person in your life. We have an F in the bass, right?
Yeah.
But the chord itself is exactly, it's B flat major 7 going to A minor, which is exactly Gotenstraße, but just with that other, you could say, other inversion in the bass. Now, I can actually play you that again with very much feeling from my MIDI. And we can just juxtapose the very sad resolving into minor chord and then the more traditional resolving in a major chord, which will sound very ugly, but I'm going to do it. Okay, and let's just go to the chords. Well, actually, maybe you should also here have a major chord, right?
And in the beginning, you mean?
Yeah, also in the beginning, and that.
Well, it didn't bother me that much actually that it was minor and then major.
Yeah, it's both possible. Having only A major chords would sound like this. And I mean, it's all very ugly because it's so beautiful having these minor resolutions. But just to juxtapose that to this very, very sad ending in a minor chord, it's really striking, I think. And our last historical account would be David Bowie, 1970, All the Madmen. You might know what it's about. To the far side of town, where the thin men stalk the streets, while the signs die underground. Right, we have the resolution to E minor from F major still we have, like in Mille Regrets, the D, D minor going to E minor, but I still think it's a subset of that connection. I still hear very Phrygian sound here.
Yeah, of
and
course.
The D being sort of maybe an ornamentation stuff like that.
Yeah, a neighboring note.
Neighboring note. In the verse, it's about that madman who is cured, so to speak, and who lost his companion to all the other madmen. Right, and so he is also feeling very lonely and very, very just out of touch with everything, with the whole world.
Yeah.
And there you get, again, this Phrygian resolve into a minor chord. I thought maybe it's more than just coincidence, and maybe it's sort of a topos. So a symbol for desolation, abandonment, and loneliness. I mean, it's not much, but it's going from Josquin Dupré all the way to David Bowie, all the way to, let's say, Rolf Hansen now.
Yeah.
2019. And so, yeah, it's quite striking. I would need more examples, but I think you would expect the resolve into a major chord and this betraying of the expectation. Phrygian is already very sad, right? But not necessarily lonely. Phrygian can be all sort of things. It can be about pain, excessive pain. It could be, but it could also be just a question placed in anguish, right? A very, very important existential question. And this is sort of a more precise subset of emotions, which would be rather in that area, being lonely, being abandoned, being out of touch with the world, right? Being something that is very closely also linked to depression. In that song, I don't think it's actually meant to be that way, but this is due to the very unique instrumentation setting, because you actually have the very light C sharp minor chord, which makes it just a bit more lighter, not so dark, right? And that's why the instrumentation is so important of these two chords.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I think he would have gotten a very dark emotion in that piece, and that's not meant to be. I talked to him briefly after the concert, expressing my happiness with how much you can find in that song and stuff like that. We also talked a bit about the emotional vibe of that song. Something that rather goes into a melancholic feeling, but not even a depression melancholia, but rather with a very calm attitude, right? So maybe nostalgia, but nostalgia is also maybe a bad word, but it's remembering with that melancholic feeling, could say. This was at least something I felt, and he supported that also. But I don't know how you might have perceived that. Maybe I shouldn't have told you in advance my perspective, but is that something you also could agree on, or is there another?
Yeah, I think that, as I said earlier, the C sharp minor chord can be almost seen as the upper structure of the D major. So it gives me more of floating quality, kind of similar to, let's say, the opening of Space Oddity, something where you have a major 7 chord that just floats around and doesn't really have a direction. The first sense of direction that you might get is from what you labeled here as B or B prime, because there the movements are much clearer. I agree that it doesn't really give me necessarily a melancholic vibe. For me, it has more, it's more something that is floating and mysterious in the sense that I don't really know where it's leading to.
Yeah, I would think when you remember, you always remember with a sense of regret, maybe, or a sense of sadness that it's actually over. but there are different kinds of remembering, right? You can remember stuff and really wishing you could go back in time.
Yeah.
But you can also remember with a sadness that it's over, but still being okay with it.
Yeah.
And in my feeling, this is sort of the vibe you can get. Also with that information that he lived there, and that it is in fact about remembering. Yeah, this explains the very unique instrumentation of these two chords. And also, of course, the whole structure with these Phrygian chords, not only here, but G to F sharp minor, and then having this very light 4/5 cadence. The whole structure is going there. And another thing I would like to mention before we go to the end of the video, the rhythm, which is a very ostinato rhythm, and which actually reminds me of the saraband rhythm. It places an emphasis on the middle of the bar. The middle note is the longest, it's a half note.
Yeah.
But it doesn't really fit into the 4/4 bar, this structure, right? So it's a bit anti-metrical. And if you would think of how can I construct a saraband rhythm in a 4/4 meter and still have this saraband vibe, I think it would be quite exactly what we get here. We have one or two 8 notes more than we need, actually. And so we would maybe add something on the first beat and on the second beat.
Yeah.
Which is, again, under that criteria personalization of traditional formula, right? Yeah, this would be the ostinato. It's really quite an ostinato here, which is in the bass always there, although you have an additional 8 note subdivision, and the melody always works with that, with that ostinato. And you see the very light moments where you have the falling fifths. You have a normal 3/4 in that case, and you have a normal, let's say, 2/4 bar. So the meter is also normalized. Maybe just for our listeners, we're just playing the most famous saraband of all times, Lascia Kyopyanga. And then maybe also the loop again in order to juxtapose that. Yeah, Rinaldo, aria Lascia Kyopyanga. And maybe again the song just to feel this, what I mean with a saraband allusion. And so on. I think it really fits also into that remembering with this sort of sad undertone. The saraband would fit into that quite well. So this would be my full analysis of this loop. It's only 9 bars in the song, but there's so much to talk about, right? So many factors, so many different levels, which all could be summarized under that topic, personalization of traditional formulas, and which all also work together. And that's really neat. I really like that. It's in my eyes, it's a very, very compelling song. And yeah, so I really wanted to do that. Okay, good. So maybe in the end, just buy the CD. I want to support the the artist by putting that video out there with possibly 60 clicks. And yeah, so it's still sunny, and we're gonna leave it with that. Today, yeah.